Senator Scott.
Mr. Caprita, I mentioned in my opening comments, and I think the chairman agrees that this has to be done in a bipartisan fashion and with a whole range of options on the table. Too often Democrats claim that Republicans want to cut Medicare every time we put or mention the troubles facing the program. So, Mr. Caprita, Democrats have a record of proposing and enacting Medicare cuts. I've already mentioned some in my statement. I'd like to have you elaborate if you agree with my statement.
Well, both parties, I would say, have sometimes put Medicare changes on the table. They have reduced spending. You can call them cuts, of course. And, you know, in the Affordable Care Act, there was a very substantial change in, particularly for inpatient hospital services, something called a productivity adjustment factor, which is still in place and permanent and has a very large cumulative effect on spending. So I think many people view it as a good thing because it's brought down hospital spending quite a bit. The question is it sustainable over the long run? We're relying very heavily on it to keep the numbers down, but the actuaries are always warning that it might be overdone.
Under Medicare for All, Mr. Capretta, what happens to provider reimbursement rates and how would that affect care, particularly in rural America?
Well, Medicare for All, I think, needs to be viewed through a political economy lens. How does it get managed over time? You know, and it's very easy to, when you're facing a budget crunch, just to pay people less. And of course, when you pay providers less, eventually there's supply changes. That means fewer providers actually provide the services at the lower rates. That's how you end up with queuing problems. So I do think that our multi-payer system, much as we dislike many aspects of it, keeps open revenue streams that makes it so that providers are not dependent on any one player to make sure they can serve patients. And so I think we shouldn't move away from that.
We always hear this business about raising taxes on the rich. During President Obama's tenure, rich was arbitrarily defined at $200,000. So as part of Obamacare, Democrats enacted 3 8/10% net investment tax at these thresholds, but didn't index them, knowing it would eventually hit middle-income taxpayers. Since this enactment, the number of taxpayers hit by this money grab have more than doubled from 3 million to 7 million. Now they're proposing to quadruple the tax and claim it'll only apply to 2% of the taxpayers. So you can understand why I'm skeptical about that statement. Mr. Capretta, much like 3 8/10% tax enacted on Obamacare, wouldn't the number of taxpayers affected by this supercharged tax increase over time, capturing more than 2% of the taxpayers?
If you don't index the income thresholds upon which a tax is applied, over time, the the real value of those thresholds, of course, erode due to inflation. So we've had bracket creep in the past in our tax system, and sometimes it's sustainable and sometimes not, depending on what's going on. There usually is eventually some pushback on it.
Yeah. President Biden's Medicare proposal and President Obama's Affordable Care Act both doubled counted Medicare revenue. So, Mr. Capretta, these are obviously underhanded gimmicks in the budget. How does this impact federal deficits and debt?
Well, I do think this is an underreported phenomenon, which is when you include on the PAYGO scorecard Medicare savings and HI in particular, you can end up double counting it. It can make the solvency of Medicare improve, which allows higher payments for Medicare down the road, and it also could be used to finance another bill, through the PAYGO scorecard. So I think what we should try to avoid when we're working on Medicare solvency is taking credit for it on both sides of the budget. Especially, a lot of times it's not big enough to make a real big difference, but Medicare's big. And so when you put a lot more money into Medicare and then also claim you can spend it under pay-go for something else, that's when you end up with a problem.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Grassley. Senator Padilla, followed by Senator Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.